I want to start this talk with a quiz, but be aware this won't be a fun quiz and there's no cash prize at the end. I'm going to make statements about two different conflicts and I want you to see if you're able to recognize each one. This first conflict began in 1994 and took place in Africa. 800,000 people died. The second conflict began in 1990 and took place in the Middle East. Between 1 and 200,000 people died. So, in my experience, when asking family and friends, more were able to identify the first conflict that I spoke about, second conflict that I spoke about, which was the Gulf War. So, why were they less able to identify the first I spoke about, which took place in Rwanda? Or, to rephrase, why do we know so much about some conflicts, but so little about others? Welcome to the theatre of global injustice, where the spotlight is selective and the script is biased. Today I'll be discussing how global powers choose whether or not to intervene in a conflict, and as a result, why we know so much more about some conflicts than others. I'd like to take you back to July of 1994, when what we now refer to as the Rwandan genocide finally came to a stop, with the loss of 800,000 Tutsi lives in 100 days. Consoli Nishimwe is a 44-year-old survivor of this atrocity, who now works as a global activist. She was just 15 when the genocide began, and in this short period of time, she lost her father, her 3 brothers, her uncles, her grandparents, and many of her friends. Due to the horrific sexual assaults inflicted upon her and many other Tutsi females, she contracted HIV. In an interview on United Nations website, she said, "We didn't want to leave, we just hoped we could die too." This is just one of the 1.1 million horrific experiences of the Tutsis who suffered. Surely global powers, such as the USA, could have massively reduced the destruction that occurred. Well, in fact, countries like the USA and the UK actually withdrew their troops from Rwanda as the genocide began. They even went as far as to refuse to recognize it as a genocide, as under international law this would have obligated them to intervene. Let's momentarily park Rwanda and move forward to a more modern conflict, the Syrian civil war. As you may know, many countries have gotten involved, including the USA, the UK, and Russia. But why get involved with this and not a recognized genocide that caused so much death and suffering in such a short amount of time? And why do we know so much about the wars in the Middle East, but so little about wars in Africa? So what are some of the reasons for an external country to get involved in a conflict? Of course, there is the obvious incentive of capital gain. If we compare countries like Syria or Afghanistan, where war and conflict has run rampant in recent years, to Rwanda, the disparity in the wealth of their natural resources, such as oil and minerals, is clear. By establishing control in countries in places like the Middle East, global powers are able to manipulate the production and distribution of their natural resources. So, clearly the motivation of capital gain is an extremely prominent factor for countries deciding whether or not to intervene. It is likely that this is one of the biggest reasons why the Rwandan genocide was so widely ignored. Why spend our money and use our resources when we get nothing of any monetary value in return? The not-so-underlying point here is that many people in positions of power seem to prioritize money and wealth over human rights. Navigating the complex landscape of geopolitics is something that global powers will inevitably approach very strategically. As these countries have the ability to dominate in places that lie much further than the countries on their borders, instability in other countries is for them opportunity to expand their influence and control. By intervening in places of high strategic interest, like the Middle East, they are able to gain power and control in the area. This explains why so many countries are constantly getting involved in Middle Eastern affairs. Ultimately, the reason why conflicts in places such as the Middle East are covered so much more in our media is because we are always either directly or indirectly involved. It may be that media outlets reporting on conflicts that we as a country have no involvement in don't receive as much attention, possibly due to the general lack of public interest. Of course, this is a great issue in itself, as we as a society should be hearing about and sympathizing over all humanitarian crises, no matter who's involved or where they're taking place. But another problem arises when conflicts are actually a heavy focus of the media. We are living in an era of untruth, where there is so much false information being manipulated and spread by a minority of the global population, who have the ability to control so much of the information that we receive. A perfect example of a conflict that we hear about regularly but receive vast amounts of disinformation about is Israel-Palestine. After the Hamas attack on October the 7th, this conflict has been thrust into the spotlight. But as many of you know, it has been going on much longer than October last year. In the years previous to 1948, when the State of Israel was established, over 700,000 Palestinians had been forced out of their homes to make way for Israeli settlers. 78% of the land was taken by Israel, with the remaining 22% being divided into the West Bank and Gaza. So, in 2007, Hamas came to power, and the illegal Israeli blockade of Gaza began, trapping over 2 million people in this small area of land. Fast forward to the modern day, and we see the culmination of all this conflict and oppression. We are witnessing one of the most brutal military campaigns in modern history. So far, over 30,000 Palestinians have been killed, at least 12,000 of which were children. 72,000 have been injured, and 1.9 million displaced. Hospitals, cemeteries, mosques, houses, and even refugee camps have been bombed. The devastation caused by this conflict has been massive for civilians on both sides, and it does not look like it will cease anytime soon. But what are the reasons for the UK's significant lack of humanitarian intervention? There are four main factors to draw upon: the Israel lobbies, our relationship with the US, money, and strategy. Both Labour and Conservative have Friends of Israel parliamentary groups. Of the Conservative MPs, 80% are members of the Conservative Friends of Israel. This group funds over a third of the current British cabinet and are the biggest donor of free overseas trips to MPs out of any organisation. Looking at the Labour Party, 2/5 of Keir Starmer's shadow cabinet have been funded by the Labour Friends of Israel. So the Israel lobby contributes a lot of money to our MPs, who seem to want to return the favour by showing their unconditional support. Additionally, the USA are Israel's biggest global defender. They supply them with billions of dollars worth in military aid. And the USA are the UK's key ally. So going against the USA by condemning Israel would damage that key relationship. This helps to explain why Keir Starmer is so set against his Labour MPs voting against a ceasefire, as he needs to prove to the US that his Labour Party wouldn't deviate from the alliance. Finally, there's money. Over the past 8 years, Israel have bought £400 million worth of arms from the UK. Just last year, we signed a trade deal worth £7 billion. And as I have said before, getting a foothold in the Middle East is incredibly important. So by having an ally in Israel, the UK's potential for power and control in the area only increases. So obviously, for our politicians, supporting Israel is very much in their interest. But the interesting thing is how the mainstream media is utilised to justify this support. Did you know that 80% of our mainstream media is owned by just 3 companies? This means that a very small amount of people have the ability to control so much of the information that we hear and see. For example, the Murdochs own News Corp, who run The Sun, The Times, The Sunday Times, and the TLS. Through their ownership of so much of our media, they are able to push the narrative and promote their ideas and beliefs, as Rupert Murdoch is famously very supportive of the Israeli state. For example, Times reporter Sam Kiley quit his post after being told not to report the murder of the 12-year-old Palestinian boy Mohammed al-Dura in the early 2000s. You may remember the very distressing image of him and his father taking shelter before being shot dead. So, evidently, the structure of the media in our country is one that is deeply damaged, not allowing for a range of information or opinions, but instead promoting the ideas and beliefs of those who are in control. So whether the conflict is Israel-Palestine, Russia-Ukraine, or the civil wars in the Congo or Ethiopia, our understandings will be shaped by factors beyond the conflicts themselves. We must remember that for every conflict, every life lost, and every narrative shaped bears the weight of humanity's collective consciousness. It is crucial that we as a society begin to question the narratives we encounter and strive for a more informed and empathetic world, where the spotlight is broadened and the script is more equitable. Thank you.